Welcome to the Nature Positive Dialogues, a special series of interviews and panels broadcast as part of the We Don't Have Time series in partnership with the Nature Positive Initiative here at COP30 in Belém. And I'm delighted to be joined by Ingrid Coetzee, who is Director of Biodiversity, Nature and Health at ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. Welcome, Ingrid. So, Ingrid, we hear often this statistic that well over half of the global population lives in cities and urban areas. Could you perhaps express to us a bit about what's the implication of that for nature and for the nature positive transition?
It's huge. I mean, another statistic is this one that globally, more than 50% of GDP is to some extent dependent on nature. And if you think that almost 80% of global GDP is generated in cities, you can understand the sort of vastness of the problem. I think at the ground level, one of the big problems of urbanization and unchecked urban growth on nature and on biodiversity is the loss of intact ecosystems, also the fact that many of the resource demands of cities are very extractive. And if we don't do it in a way that is nature positive and takes ecosystems and biodiversity into consideration, it can very quickly lead to huge problems, problems of floodings because mangroves have been destroyed. But on the other hand, besides being drivers of biodiversity loss, the other side of that coin is that often cities are innovators of solutions in terms of using nature and working with nature and planning with nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've just come here. We're in Belém, of course, for COP30, and that's hot on the heels of C40 Cities, the World Mayors Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Can you maybe list out a few ideas of how critically cities and local governments can help lead the transition to a nature positive future that's also good for people and good for the climate?
So there are a number of ways. So in the experience of ICLEI working with around 3,000 cities in 125 countries globally over 3 decades, one of the ways that we've seen is at the level of planning. So planning, land use and spatial planning are very important tools. The second one is, for example, looking at the use of ecosystem-based approaches or nature-based solutions to address urban challenges such as flooding, heat island effect, cooling, etc., as a first port of call instead of just going for a grey solution. I think a third one is really the whole point of bringing in very innovative mechanisms to help fill that finance gap. Cities often have limited financial resources, and what we're seeing more and more is that cities are going for blended finance opportunities or public-private partnerships, even venturing into things like green bonds. We have a case in point in Africa, for example, where a relatively small city, a coastal city, has a peatland, a wetland, that has been really ravaged by flooding and fires, what we call veld fires. And they have, through the UNEP ICLEI Generation Restoration Project, they got a bit of catalytic funding to restore the peatland. And that, in a sense, was a catalyst for the private sector to start investing in small, medium enterprises, but also attracting global interest for a biodiversity credit. So these are some of the sorts of things that cities are starting to do, actually.
So lots of amazing innovation and great work happening. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges to scaling those solutions and ideas? And also what would be some critical enablers that we need to happen?
I think probably the biggest problem is the one that I mentioned now, the access to funding. Not many cities have the ability to generate revenue. They're dependent on central government, but also the fact that they have they don't have direct access to global funds. I know that the GEF is working on making that more accessible to cities. Capacity is a huge problem. So cities have great ideas, wonderful ideas, and they have got concepts, but they lack the capacity to develop these into a pipeline of bankable projects that will attract investors. Another one is the question of data. Huge problem. They don't have, the University of Pennsylvania, under the Generation Restoration Project, did a very interesting assessment. They came out with a report on the whole notion of how nature-based solutions are used at the city level and how they get them into the budgets. Very low percentage, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the cities don't have the data that they need to be able to build those cases, make the arguments to the finance departments or to the investors. But data is also important in terms of monitoring, tracking progress and reporting, whether it is reporting at the city level or into the country level or at the global platform. So some of the enablers would obviously be legal systems, opening up, as I said, the ability for direct access. And one thing that we've done with the CBD Secretariat is building on a decision that was adopted in Montreal a few years ago, and now the follow-up decision in Rome last year was to say, look, it's really important that cities also report on their commitments and their action. And the Cities with Nature and the Regions with Nature platforms, which is hosted by ICLEI, but our partnership initiatives with UNEP, IUCN, etc., are recognized as commitment and reporting platforms. And we're working with the CBD Secretariat to make sure that the city's actions are being fed into the global biodiversity stocktake. That's really important because that's where investors will see what's really happening on the ground and the power of local action towards global targets.
Absolutely. And among all of that context, you mentioned there the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're looking forward to COP17 in 2026. We are now in Belém for COP30, the climate conference. What would you say are some key actions that we need to see coming out of these massive COPs to help drive forward the nature positive transition in cities?
For me, there are three things. I'm looking at it from the perspective of nature positive and from biodiversity's perspective. I'm not a climate expert, but the three things for me that are important is, number one, the fact that we have to recognize that given the global sort of geopolitical picture, the triple planetary crisis, we need climate and biodiversity action in tandem, not forgetting also the pollution, the need for pollution action as well. The second thing is that we need to really emphasize and prioritize funding for, and this is certainly something we're hoping to come from this COP, increased finance for adaptation actions, particularly at the local level. And when I talk about adaptation from a biodiversity perspective, I want to see something that has embedded in it an ecosystem-based approach so that it's also about biodiversity and not just using biodiversity as a means to another end. And then I think the third thing that's really important is recognizing that cities are the level of government that are closest to the people. When the disaster hits, the people go to the mayor. They do not go to the president or the premier. And I really think it's important that we get the parties to recognize that also in the climate COP, as we have in the biodiversity COP, a convention, and really set up enabling systems to mobilize and to strengthen the role and the contributions that cities can do and can really just amplify and scale that around the world.
Yes, and thinking again ahead to 2026, we just recently heard the exciting announcement that the second Global Nature Positive Summit will be taking place in July 2026 in Kumamoto City in Japan. How do you see that as a key stepping stone, again, towards the nature positive transition and for cities?
Well, we're very excited because, as you know, ICLEI is one of the partners, and we're really very excited about this summit. For us, it's certainly a very important milestone in the journey from Belém to Yerevan. There's major other events like the World Urban Forum, there's the subsidiary meetings that are happening, but the Nature Positive Summit is nicely positioned in the middle. So you can use that to build on what's coming out of Belém, also from the subsidiary meetings in the WAF. We all convene in Kumamoto in Japan, and there the emphasis is very much on nature positive development, looking at it from a wider perspective and those sorts of mechanisms and things that we need. I mean, we're beginning to see that language coming more and more in government policy positions, in city biodiversity plans, in their climate plans as well. Japan, in its National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, has adopted the whole notion of nature positive development, which aligns with the mission of the Global Biodiversity Framework on more nature in 2030 than we had in 2010. So I think it's a very important event. We certainly are pushing it as such. It's part of our roadmap. We're working with the CBD Secretariat, all of our partners, UNEP, Regions 4, IUCN, and for us it's really important to gather all the levels of government, but very, very importantly, the private sector. They need to come to the party, and in the decision, 1632, around resource mobilization, there's a very small but very, very important clause about trying to fill the biodiversity finance gap with opening it up for resources from other sources, including the private sector. And that is such an important thing. And I really think that this summit, the Nature Positive Summit, is the ideal platform to mobilize and to get that message across.
Thanks, Ingrid. And perhaps just lastly, a brief question to close. What does Nature Positive mean to you?
Well, for me, it's certainly a very important paradigm shift. It's how you approach development. ICLEI has a nature-based development pathway, and for us, the whole Nature Positive thing aligns with that. So it's about planning, implementing, investing in ways that will lead to development and action that supports the goals and targets of the Kunming Biodiversity Framework, Global Biodiversity Framework, so that, as I said just now, that by 2030 we've reached the point where we've increased, the curve in biodiversity loss has been bent back. So we have more diversity as a result of actions and policies and regulations and planning decisions coming out, and we're restoring our ecosystems so that the picture is better by 2030, and by 2050 we can get to living in harmony with nature, which is really what we're going to have to do. So for me, it's very much aligned with the GBF, the spirit of the GBF, and what we have to do if we're going to save ourselves as people and protect nature and biodiversity and deal with the climate and pollution crises.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ingrid Coetzee from ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. And as we've said, everything is connected. The climate and nature crises are extremely interlinked, and we need joined up solutions. The urban world, more than half of the global population live in cities. Cities have plenty of ideas and innovation and drive. We're not short of those innovations, but what we need is more capacity, more finance, and really looking to city leadership to help drive that change towards nature positive future. Thank you.